A journey of reflection. At 68, John Carter had spent his life dedicated to service. A retired lieutenant general in the U.S. Army, he had a reputation for integrity, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Despite his illustrious career, John was a humble man who valued simplicity and found joy in the small things. Now, after over 4 decades of service, he finally had time to embrace a slower pace of life. This day was special. John was preparing to fly across the country to Seattle to visit a childhood friend he hadn't seen in over 30 years. Memories of their shared laughter and long summer afternoons flashed through his mind as he packed. It wasn't just a reunion. It was a reconnection to a part of his life that felt untouched by the passage of time. John's travel outfit mirrored his personality, simple and understated. He wore a clean white shirt tucked neatly into a pair of well-worn khakis, and his polished leather shoes, though aged, gleamed with care. A small, nondescript suitcase accompanied him, containing nothing more than the essentials. The airport bustled with travelers of all kinds. Families hurried to gates, business people briskly maneuvered with briefcases in hand, and vacationers moved with leisurely excitement. John blended seamlessly into the crowd. As he passed through security, a few of the officers recognized his name from his ID and offered quiet nods of respect. He returned the gestures with a warm smile, but his mind remained focused on the journey ahead. Upon reaching the gate, John handed over his first-class ticket, a rare indulgence he allowed himself for the long flight. The gate attendant greeted him with courtesy and directed him toward the plane. As he entered the luxurious first-class cabin, he took in the quiet elegance of the space. Spacious seats, soft lighting, and a tranquil atmosphere promised a comfortable journey. John chose a window seat, stowed his suitcase in the overhead compartment, and settled in with a small book. His plan was simple: read for a while and enjoy the view as the plane carried him toward a long-awaited reunion. His presence was unobtrusive, and most of the other passengers barely noticed him. He preferred it that way. The moments before takeoff were calm, almost meditative. The soft hum of conversation, the occasional rustle of newspapers, and the gentle clinking of glasses created an atmosphere of quiet anticipation. John felt at peace. But peace, as it often does, proved to be fleeting. A man entered the first-class cabin just before the flight crew began their final preparations. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a police officer's uniform with an air of authority. His name tag read Mark Turner. Mark was in his early 40s, his demeanor sharp and commanding. He had been tasked with conducting a final security check before takeoff, a routine procedure, but one that carried the weight of scrutiny. Mark's eyes scanned the cabin, moving from one passenger to the next. When his gaze landed on John Carter, it lingered. Something about John, a plainly dressed black man seated in first class, triggered a wave of suspicion in Mark's mind. Though the cabin was filled with passengers from various walks of life, Mark's attention fixated solely on John. The officer approached John with deliberate steps, his eyes narrowing. The surrounding passengers noticed the interaction and began to watch, their conversations fading into silence. "Excuse me, sir," Mark said, his tone clipped and authoritative. "Are you a first-class passenger?" John looked up from his book, his expression calm but curious. "Yes, I am," he replied simply. "May I see your ticket and identification?" Mark's voice carried an edge that suggested this was more than a routine request. John's brow furrowed slightly. "I've already shown my identification at the gate," he said, his tone measured. "Is there a problem?" "I'll decide if there's a problem," Mark retorted, his voice growing sharper. "Let me see your papers." The tension in the cabin rose as passengers exchanged glances, some pulling out their phones to discreetly record the unfolding scene. John hesitated for a moment, not out of defiance but out of an innate sense of fairness. He had followed every protocol, and yet here he was, being singled out. Finally, John reached into his pocket and retrieved his ticket and ID. He handed them to Mark, who examined them with exaggerated care, flipping the documents back and forth as if searching for an inconsistency. His deliberate actions stretched the moment into an uncomfortable silence. After an agonizing pause, Mark handed the documents back with a grudging nod. "Everything seems to be in order," he muttered, though his tone implied otherwise. "Thank you," John replied, his voice steady. He returned the papers to his pocket and resumed his seat, hoping the matter was resolved. But Mark wasn't finished. "I'll need to inspect your luggage," he announced, gesturing toward the overhead compartment. John's calm demeanor gave way to a hint of frustration. "My luggage was thoroughly checked by airport security," he said. "I see no reason for it to be examined again." Mark crossed his arms, his stance firm. "Are you refusing to comply?" he demanded. "Because if you are, I'll have no choice but to remove you from this flight." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring John to respond. The passengers, now fully invested in the confrontation, watched with bated breath. John stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He locked eyes with Mark, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Officer," he said, his voice low but firm, "I've served this country for over 40 years. I've faced challenges far greater than this, but I will not stand here and allow you to abuse your authority." The statement, delivered with quiet conviction, seemed to catch Mark off guard. For a moment, the officer faltered, his confidence shaken, but his pride quickly reasserted itself. "Take down the suitcase," Mark ordered, his voice rising. "Now." John took a deep breath, his patience wearing thin. The years of discipline that had shaped him as a soldier now guided his actions. "No," he said firmly. "You have no grounds for this search, and I won't allow it." The defiance in John's words ignited something in Mark, a dangerous mix of anger and humiliation. He reached for the gun holstered at his side, his fingers trembling with a mix of adrenaline and rage. The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers gasped and shouted, their voices a cacophony of fear and disbelief. A flight attendant stepped forward, her face pale with shock, but her words were drowned out by the commotion. John remained motionless, his calm unbroken even as the barrel of the gun pointed directly at him. Years of military training had prepared him for moments like this, moments when courage and composure were the only defenses against chaos. "Think carefully about what you're doing," John said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Every action has consequences." Mark hesitated, his grip on the weapon tightening. The scene teetered on the edge of disaster, the air thick with tension. And then, with deliberate calm, John reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for his phone. As he dialed a number, his gaze never wavered from Mark's face. "What are you doing?" Mark demanded, his voice tinged with panic. "I'm calling your superior," John replied. His voice, though quiet, carried a weight that silenced the cabin. The call connected, and a voice on the other end answered with immediate respect. "Lieutenant General Carter, how can I assist you?" John's reply was simple. "I need you at Gate 12 immediately." The moment would change everything. Confrontation in the skies. As the call ended, the cabin descended into an eerie silence. The passengers, stunned by what had unfolded, exchanged nervous glances. Some whispered in hushed tones, while others discreetly recorded the event on their phones. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unease as everyone awaited the next move. John Carter, a man whose presence carried an understated authority, sat back down calmly, his phone now resting on the small tray table in front of him. Despite the intense situation, his demeanor remained steady, an anchor amidst the chaos. Decades of military service had trained him to face crises with composure, and this moment was no exception. Officer Mark Turner, on the other hand, was visibly rattled. His hand hovered over the holster where his gun had been moments ago, the weapon now safely returned but the damage done. His face flushed with frustration and confusion. He scanned the cabin for support, but found none. The murmurs among passengers betrayed their disapproval, and their judging eyes bore into him, deepening his unease. "Everyone, please remain seated," the head flight attendant announced, her voice trembling slightly but attempting to assert control. "We're handling the situation." Mark glared at her briefly, then turned his attention back to John. "You think calling someone is going to change anything?" He sneered, his voice carrying more bravado than confidence. "I'm doing my job, ensuring the safety of this flight." John met his gaze with a calm intensity. "Your job is to protect and serve, not intimidate and harass," he said evenly. "And what you've done here goes far beyond the scope of your authority." Mark's jaw tightened. "Don't lecture me, old man. I don't care who you think you are." At that moment, hurried footsteps echoed from the jet bridge leading to the cabin. The door opened, and a man in a sharp navy blue uniform stepped inside, flanked by two other officers. His silver hair and sharp eyes exuded authority, and his presence immediately commanded attention. It was David Harris, the chief of police and Mark Turner's superior. "Lieutenant General Carter?" Harris asked, his tone respectful and professional as his eyes scanned the cabin. When they landed on John, he gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, his face momentarily softening. John rose from his seat, extending a hand. "Chief Harris, thank you for responding so quickly." Harris shook his hand firmly. "Of course, sir. I regret that it's under these circumstances." He turned sharply to Mark, his expression hardening. "Officer Turner, what is the meaning of this?" Mark's face paled. "Chief, I was conducting a routine security check." This man was being uncooperative. "Uncooperative," Harris interrupted, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "You pointed a firearm at an unarmed passenger on a commercial flight. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Mark stammered, struggling to find his footing. "Sir," he looked suspicious. "I was trying to—" "Enough," Harris snapped, cutting him off. He turned to the flight attendant. "Miss, can you confirm what happened here?" The flight attendant, still visibly shaken, stepped forward. "Officer Turner singled out this passenger without cause," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "He demanded to see his papers and inspect his luggage, even though all protocols had already been followed. When the passenger refused further harassment, Officer Turner escalated the situation, drawing his weapon." Harris closed his eyes briefly, exhaling sharply. "Thank you. That will be all for now." He faced Mark again, his expression now one of disappointment and fury. "Do you realize the gravity of your actions, Officer Turner? Drawing a weapon in this context is not just a breach of protocol, it's reckless endangerment." Mark's eyes darted around the cabin, his bravado crumbling under the weight of his superior's reprimand. "Sir, I thought—" "You thought wrong," Harris interrupted. "Stand down immediately. You are relieved of your duties pending an investigation." The passengers erupted into murmurs of approval and relief as Mark reluctantly unbuckled his holster and handed it over to one of the officers accompanying Harris. His shoulders slumped, and he looked as though the ground might swallow him whole. As the tension in the cabin began to dissipate, Harris turned back to John. "General Carter, I cannot express how sorry I am for this unacceptable behavior. Please know this is not representative of the standards we uphold." John nodded, his expression one of calm resolve. "Thank you, Chief Harris. I trust you'll handle this matter appropriately." "I assure you, sir, we will," Harris replied. He turned back to the flight attendant. "Is the plane ready for departure?" "Yes, sir," she replied, glancing at the cockpit for confirmation. "We're just waiting for clearance." "Good." Harris looked around the cabin, addressing the passengers. "I apologize for the disruption. Officer Turner will be escorted off the plane immediately, and we will ensure that your flight proceeds without further incident." Mark was led out of the cabin, his head hanging low as he passed rows of passengers who watched him with a mix of anger and disdain. The door to the jet bridge closed behind him, and the sense of tension that had gripped the cabin finally began to ease. John returned to his seat, his calm demeanor never faltering. The flight attendant approached him with a glass of water. "Sir, Is there anything else we can do for you?" "No, thank you," John said, offering her a reassuring smile. "I'm fine." As the plane prepared for takeoff, the passengers around him began to relax, resuming their conversations and activities. But the events of the past hour lingered in the air, a poignant reminder of the challenges that still persisted in society. John opened his book again, though his thoughts remained elsewhere. He knew this incident was far from over. The actions of one man had exposed a deeper issue, one that could not be ignored. In his heart, John resolved to use this moment as a catalyst for change. This was not just about him. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure such indignity. As the plane ascended into the clouds, John looked out the window, his mind already formulating the steps he would take next. This journey, meant to be a simple reunion with an old friend, had become something much larger. And John Carter, a man of unwavering resolve, was ready to rise to the occasion. A call to action. The plane soared through the clouds, the cabin finally settling into a calm rhythm. Passengers began to relax, though the earlier confrontation lingered in their minds. Some whispered among themselves, recounting the tense moments, while others scrolled through their phones, watching the videos they had just recorded. For many, it was a surreal experience, a confrontation that revealed uncomfortable truths about power and prejudice. John Carter sat by the window, gazing out at the vast expanse of sky. His book lay forgotten on his lap. The events of the last hour played over in his mind, each moment sharpening his resolve. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something deeper, something systemic. John's years of military service had taught him to recognize when a battle needed to be fought, and this was one of those moments. A soft knock on his tray table pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, standing nervously beside him. His phone was clutched tightly in one hand, and his expression was a mix of hesitation and admiration. "Excuse me, sir," the young man began, his voice low. "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to him. That took a lot of courage." John offered a small, warm smile. "Thank you. But I didn't do it for courage. I did it because it was the right thing to do." The young man nodded, his grip on the phone tightening. "I recorded what happened. A lot of us did. People need to see what you went through. Maybe it'll make them think twice about letting things like this happen." John's smile faded slightly as he considered the young man's words. "Sharing the truth is important," he said carefully. "But it's also important to use that truth wisely. What we do with it matters more than anything." The young man seemed to consider this, nodding again. "I'll think about that, sir. Thank you." With that, he returned to his seat, leaving John alone with his thoughts once more. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, John could feel the weight of what lay ahead. The incident would not simply fade away. The passengers who had witnessed it were already sharing their accounts, their videos, and their outrage. By the time the plane landed, the world would know what had happened in that first-class cabin. John wasn't naive. He understood the power of public opinion, but he also knew its dangers. Outrage could spark change, but it could also devolve into chaos. If this story was to become a catalyst for meaningful progress, it needed to be handled with care. The moment the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, John's phone buzzed incessantly. Messages flooded in from colleagues, friends, and even reporters who had somehow already learned of the incident. Word had traveled fast, too fast. It was clear that the videos had gone viral, and the public was demanding answers. As he disembarked, John noticed a small group of reporters waiting near the baggage claim area. Their cameras and microphones pointed directly at him, their voices rising as they tried to get his attention. "General Carter, can you comment on the incident during your flight? Do you believe the officers' actions were racially motivated? What message do you have for people who experience similar treatment?" John raised a hand, signaling for silence. His calm, steady demeanor commanded their attention. "I appreciate your concern and your questions," he began, his voice measured. But this is not the time for sensationalism. What happened today was a symptom of a larger issue, one that requires thoughtful dialogue and meaningful action. I will address this matter when the time is right. For now, I ask for patience and respect." His response was met with a flurry of additional questions, but John moved past the reporters, his small suitcase in hand. He had no interest in becoming the center of a media frenzy. His goal was clear: to turn this moment into a force for positive change. Later that evening, John sat in the living room of his friend's home, the fireplace casting a warm glow across the room. His childhood friend, Harold Mitchell, was a retired school teacher with a passion for community activism. The two men shared a deep bond forged through years of mutual respect and shared values. "I saw the video, John," Harold said, his voice heavy with concern. "It's already everywhere. People are outraged, and rightfully so. But what do you want to do about it?" John leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about me, Harold. It's about the countless others who face discrimination and abuse of power every day. People who don't have the platform or the voice to stand up for themselves." Harold nodded slowly. "So what's the plan?" John sat forward, his gaze intense. "I want to use this moment to start a conversation, one that goes beyond outrage and leads to real solutions. We need better training for law enforcement, stronger accountability measures, and a renewed focus on respect and dignity for all." Harold smiled faintly. "That's ambitious, but if anyone can do it, it's you." The two men spent hours discussing strategies, drafting ideas, and considering the best ways to approach the issue. John's military background had taught him the importance of planning, and he was determined to approach this fight with the same precision and discipline he had applied to every mission in his career. The next morning, John held a press conference at a local community center. The room was packed with reporters, community leaders, and concerned citizens. Cameras flashed as John stepped to the podium, his presence commanding but humble. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "Before I say anything else, I want to thank everyone who has reached out with their support. Your kindness and concern mean more than words can express." He paused, letting the room settle. What happened on that flight was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a broader issue, one that we cannot ignore. Discrimination, abuse of power, and a lack of accountability have no place in our society. We must do better. And that starts with all of us. John outlined a series of initiatives he planned to champion, including increased funding for diversity and de-escalation training for law enforcement, the creation of independent oversight boards, and community engagement programs designed to build trust between officers and the people they serve. "I am not here to seek revenge or to single out one individual," he concluded. "I am here to ensure that we address the root causes of these issues so that no one else has to endure what I did. Together, we can create a society where respect, dignity, and justice are not just ideals, but realities." The room erupted into applause, the energy palpable. John's words had struck a chord, resonating with a public eager for change. In the days that followed, John's message spread far and wide. Media outlets praised his calm and measured response, while community leaders rallied behind his initiatives. Social media was flooded with posts of support, many calling him a true leader and an inspiration. But for John, this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but he was prepared to walk it. He had faced battles before, and he would face this one with the same unwavering resolve. Because for John Carter, this was not just a fight for himself. It was a fight for justice, for dignity, and for a better future for all. Ripples of change. The days following the incident on the flight were a whirlwind of activity. The video of the confrontation had gone viral, sparking debates across social media platforms, news channels, and even in community meetings. The stark imagery of a calm, elderly black man facing down a gun-wielding officer had struck a nerve, igniting discussions about systemic prejudice and abuse of power in a way that few events had before. John Carter, however, remained focused. For him, this wasn't about basking in public sympathy or condemnation of a single individual. It was about leveraging the attention to bring about real, lasting change. As he often reminded himself during his military career, battles are won not with emotion, but with strategy. The public outcry. The public's reaction to the incident was both swift and polarizing. Activists and community leaders seized the opportunity to highlight the broader issues of racial profiling and abuse of authority. Social media platforms were flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForCarter and #NWCOffPower, while protests erupted in several cities, demanding reforms in policing and accountability. At the same time, some voices pushed back, defending Officer Mark Turner's actions as an overreaction born from the pressures of his job. This counter-narrative, though vocal, was dwarfed by the overwhelming support for John and calls for justice. News anchors debated the incident, analyzing every frame of the now-viral video. Legal experts weighed in on the implications of the officer's actions, while psychologists discussed the impact of racial bias on decision-making under stress. The story had transcended the confines of a single airplane cabin, becoming a national conversation. John's reluctant role. In the midst of this media storm, John found himself thrust into the spotlight, a position he neither sought nor relished. He had always preferred working behind the scenes, letting his actions speak louder than his words. But now, the weight of public expectation rested heavily on his shoulders. Harold Mitchell, ever the pragmatist, had anticipated this. "You're a symbol now, John," he said during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "People are looking to you for leadership. Whether you like it or not, you've been called to the front lines of this fight." John sighed, rubbing his temples. "I didn't ask for this, Harold. I just wanted to visit an old friend." "I know," Harold replied gently, "but sometimes the battles choose us, not the other way around." With Harold's encouragement, John began to shape his response. He agreed to a series of interviews with carefully selected journalists, emphasizing his desire to focus on systemic change rather than personal grievances. Each interview was measured, his words deliberate and thoughtful. "I'm not interested in punishing one man," he told a reporter from the Washington Post. "This isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure the humiliation and fear that I experienced. This is an opportunity to address the root causes of these issues and to demand better from those who are sworn to protect us." The turning point. John's message resonated, but he knew that words alone wouldn't suffice. To create tangible change, he needed allies, people in positions of influence who could turn ideas into action. With Harold's help, he began reaching out to community organizations, civil rights groups, and even members of law enforcement who were committed to reform. One of the first to join his cause was Chief David Harris, the very officer who had reprimanded Mark Turner on the plane. Harris, a seasoned law enforcement leader with decades of experience, was deeply troubled by the incident and eager to make amends. "I can't change what happened, but I can ensure it never happens again," Harris told John during their first meeting after the flight. "Let's work together to create real accountability." Their partnership marked a significant turning point. With Harris's backing, John was able to organize a series of town hall meetings, bringing together citizens, activists, and police officers to discuss the challenges and solutions. These meetings, held in cities across the country, became a platform for honest dialogue and mutual understanding. The disciplinary hearing. Meanwhile, the disciplinary proceedings against Mark Turner moved forward. The public outcry had forced the police department to act swiftly, convening an internal review board to examine his actions. The hearing was closed to the public, but its outcome would have far-reaching implications. John was asked to testify, a request he reluctantly accepted. On the day of the hearing, he entered the austere conference room with the same calm resolve that had defined him throughout his career. Mark Turner sat at the far end of the table, his face pale and drawn. As John recounted the events of the flight, he spoke not with anger, but with a quiet dignity that left the room in silence. "I don't hate Officer Turner," he said. But his actions were a stark reminder of the biases and abuses that persist in our society. This isn't about one man. It's about ensuring that no one else suffers the same indignity. When Turner was given the chance to speak, his voice wavered with regret. "I let my biases cloud my judgment," he admitted. "I made a mistake, and I take full responsibility for my actions." The review board ultimately decided to terminate Turner's employment, citing gross misconduct and endangerment of civilian lives. It was a decision that sent a clear message about the consequences of abuse of power. A movement takes shape. While Turner's dismissal brought some closure, John remained focused on the bigger picture. The incident had sparked a movement, and he was determined to ensure its momentum didn't fade. With the support of Chief Harris and other allies, John launched the Integrity in Law Enforcement Initiative, ILEI, a national campaign aimed at improving police training, fostering community engagement, and implementing independent oversight mechanisms. The initiative garnered widespread support, attracting endorsements from prominent figures and organizations. John's speeches at ILEI events became a source of inspiration for many. "Courage isn't just about standing up to injustice," he told a packed auditorium in Chicago. "It's about working together to build a better future. This is our chance to turn pain into progress." Reflections. One evening, as John sat alone in Harold's living room, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The journey had been exhausting, but it had also been profoundly meaningful. The incident on the plane had been a spark, igniting a fire that now burned brightly across the nation. Harold entered the room, a cup of tea in each hand. "You've done good work, John," he said, handing him a cup. "But don't forget to take care of yourself. Movements are marathons, not sprints." John smiled faintly. "I know, but if we don't keep pushing, the momentum could fade." "And it won't," Harold assured him, "because you've planted seeds, and those seeds will grow, even when you're not the one tending them." John nodded, his gaze drifting to the window where the city lights twinkled in the distance. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but he was no stranger to long battles. This, after all, was a fight worth winning. Building bridges. Weeks had passed since the incident on the flight, and the story showed no signs of fading from public consciousness. If anything, it had grown into a national rallying cry for justice and reform. News outlets continued to dissect the events, highlighting systemic issues that extended far beyond one officer's actions. Across the country, people were holding difficult but necessary conversations about race, power, and accountability. John Carter, however, was not content to let the movement rest on public outrage alone. He understood that lasting change required collaboration, structure, and a shared vision. With the Integrity in Law Enforcement Initiative, ILEI, gaining traction, John focused his efforts on bringing together a diverse coalition of voices: community leaders, law enforcement officials, educators, and activists. His goal was ambitious: to transform outrage into action and division into dialogue. A crucial partnership. Chief David Harris quickly became one of John's most valuable allies. Despite his initial embarrassment over Officer Turner's actions, Harris had proven himself a man of principle, eager to lead the charge for reform within his department. Together, they organized a groundbreaking event, the first ever National Law Enforcement and Community Summit, designed to foster understanding and collaboration between police forces and the communities they served. Held in Washington, D.C., the summit drew hundreds of attendees from across the country. Police chiefs, officers, activists, and community members filled the conference hall, each group representing different perspectives, but sharing a common goal: to make things better. On the first day of the summit, John stood at the podium, addressing the crowd with his characteristic calm and conviction. "We are here today because we all want the same thing, EVN. A society where justice is fair, trust is mutual, and respect is universal. This is not a battle between law enforcement and the people. This is a partnership, and like any partnership, it begins with listening. The crowd erupted into applause, but John raised his hand, signaling for quiet. Listening alone is not enough, he continued. We must take what we hear and turn it into actionable change. That is why we are here, to listen, to learn, and to act. Over the next 3 days, the summit featured panels, workshops, and small group discussions. Officers shared their experiences of working in high-pressure environments, while community members spoke candidly about their fear and mistrust of the police. The conversations were raw and, at times, contentious, but they were also deeply constructive. The stories that matter. One of the most impactful moments came during a panel titled Breaking Barriers, personal stories from both sides. A young black man named Jamal shared his story of being wrongly arrested during a traffic stop, his voice trembling as he recounted the humiliation and fear he felt that day. I was treated like I didn't belong, like I was a threat just because of the color of my skin, Jamal said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. It made me question everything I believed about justice. Sitting beside him was Officer Maria Lopez, a veteran police officer from Los Angeles. She listened intently, her expression one of empathy and regret. When it was her turn to speak, she began with a confession. I've made mistakes in my career, Maria admitted. I've acted on biases I wasn't even aware I had. But stories like Jamal's remind me why I became an officer in the first place, to serve and protect everyone, not just some. We need to do better, and I'm here to learn how. The room fell silent as the weight of their words settled over the audience. It was a moment of vulnerability and honesty that underscored the summit's purpose, to humanize both sides and find common ground. A plan for change. By the end of the summit, John and his team had developed a comprehensive action plan, which they called the Blueprint for Trust and Accountability. The plan included several key initiatives. Mandatory bias training. All law enforcement officers would undergo intensive training to recognize and address implicit biases. Independent oversight boards. Local communities would establish independent boards to review complaints against officers, ensuring transparency and accountability. Community policing programs. Departments would prioritize initiatives that encouraged officers to build relationships with the communities they served, such as mentorship programs and neighborhood events. De-escalation training. Officers would receive advanced training in conflict resolution techniques to reduce the use of force in non-threatening situations. Data transparency. Police departments would be required to publicly release data on arrests, stops, and use of force incidents, broken down by demographics. The plan was ambitious, but it was also practical. It acknowledged the challenges faced by both law enforcement and communities, offering solutions that benefited everyone. We cannot fix what we do not measure, John explained during the summit's closing address, and we cannot rebuild trust without accountability. This blueprint is not the end. It's a beginning. Facing resistance. Not everyone welcomed the plan with open arms. Some police unions voiced concerns, arguing that the initiatives unfairly painted all officers as biased or abusive. Meanwhile, a small but vocal group of activists criticized the blueprint for not going far enough, calling for the complete defunding of police departments. John faced the criticism head-on, holding a series of town hall meetings to address concerns on both sides. Change is hard, he said during one such meeting in Atlanta. It challenges our assumptions and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. But doing nothing is not an option. We have to find a path forward together. Despite the resistance, the blueprint gained momentum. Several major cities, including New York, Chicago, and Seattle, adopted its principles, with local governments pledging funding to implement the proposed initiatives. Media outlets praised the plan as a rare example of pragmatic leadership in a polarized time. Mark Turner's reckoning. While John focused on the future, the consequences of the past continued to unfold. Mark Turner, the officer at the center of the flight incident, faced both professional and legal repercussions. In addition to losing his job, he was charged with reckless endangerment and abuse of authority. During his trial, Mark expressed remorse, acknowledging the harm he had caused. "I let my biases control my actions," he admitted in court. "I wish I could take it back, but I can't. All I can do now is take responsibility." The jury found Mark guilty on multiple counts, sentencing him to community service and mandatory participation in bias training programs. The sentence, though lenient compared to what some had hoped for, served as a reminder of the need for accountability at every level. A beacon of hope. As the weeks turned into months, John's efforts began to bear fruit. Communities reported increased trust in their local police departments, and officers who embraced the new initiatives found their work more fulfilling and impactful. One evening, as John prepared to leave another town hall meeting, a young girl approached him, her mother standing a few steps behind. The girl held out a piece of paper, a crayon drawing of a man in uniform, with the words, "Thank you," written in bold letters. "Is this for me?" John asked, crouching to meet her at eye level. She nodded shyly. "My mom says you're a hero." John smiled, his eyes glistening. "Thank you, but the real heroes are people like you, people who care enough to make a difference." As he left the meeting that night, the weight of the journey ahead felt a little lighter. For John Carter, the fight for justice and dignity was far from over, but moments like these reminded him why it was worth it. The ripples of change he had set in motion were growing. One community, one conversation, one act of courage at a time. Legacy of change. Months had passed since the confrontation on the airplane, and the world seemed to move forward, as it always did. Yet for John Carter, the journey he had begun was far from over. The ripples of that single moment of injustice had grown into waves of reform, dialogue, and renewed hope for communities across the nation. But progress, he knew, was not a straight path. It was a climb, and the summit was still far from sight. A movement solidified. The Integrity in Law Enforcement Initiative, ILEI, born from the painful events on that flight, had transformed into a robust national movement. Chapters had sprung up in cities and towns, each tailoring the initiative's principles to the unique challenges faced by their communities. John had become a sought-after speaker, traveling tirelessly to meet with policymakers, law enforcement leaders, and grassroots organizations. At each event, he spoke not just of reform, but of reconciliation. "Justice is not about retribution," he would often say. "It's about restoration. It's about rebuilding trust where it has been broken." His words resonated deeply, particularly with younger generations. Students, inspired by his story, formed clubs to advocate for accountability and fairness in their local systems. Universities invited him to speak at commencement ceremonies, where he urged graduates to lead with integrity and courage, regardless of their chosen paths. Yet, John remained grounded. Fame and recognition had never been his goal. Every accolade, every headline was simply a reminder of the work still left to do. Challenges from within and without. While the movement flourished, it also faced its share of obstacles. Opponents, particularly from hardline factions within law enforcement, pushed back against the reforms, claiming they undermined the authority and morale of officers. Some communities, wary of change, resisted implementing the initiatives, citing costs or logistical concerns. At a heated public meeting in Texas, a local sheriff challenged John directly. "With all due respect, General Carter," the sheriff said, his voice thick with skepticism, "you've never walked a beat in a tough neighborhood. How can you understand what it's like to face life and death decisions every day?" John, unshaken, responded with the calm authority that had become his hallmark. "You're right, Sheriff, I've never walked your beat, but I've commanded soldiers in life and death situations where every decision carried the weight of lives, both ours and theirs. And I can tell you this, accountability and respect for those we serve do not weaken us. They make us stronger." The room erupted in applause, but John's words carried more than conviction. They carried truth. Even the sheriff, though visibly reluctant, nodded in acknowledgement. Mark Turner's redemption. Meanwhile, Mark Turner's life had taken a drastically different turn. After losing his job and facing legal consequences, he found himself at a crossroads. For months, he lived in relative obscurity, grappling with guilt and the public shame of his actions. It was during a community service event, part of his court-mandated sentence, that Mark encountered a turning point. He was assigned to work at a local youth center, where many of the children came from underserved communities. At first, he approached the task with reluctance, but as he spent more time with the children, he began to see the world through their eyes. One day, a teenage boy named Ander asked him bluntly, "Why did you pull that gun on Mr. Carter? What made you think he didn't belong?" The question, though delivered without malice, pierced through Mark's defenses. For the first time, he spoke openly about his biases and the fear that had driven his actions. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "I let my fear and assumptions control me, and it hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to learn from it." The youth center became a place of redemption for Mark. He eventually began leading workshops for at-risk teens, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and a lesson in humility. Over time, he earned the respect of the community he had once alienated. A pivotal meeting. As part of his own journey, Mark reached out to John. It was a request John did not take lightly. For weeks, he deliberated, consulting with Harold and others he trusted. Ultimately, he agreed, believing in the power of dialogue to heal wounds. The meeting took place in a small private conference room. When Mark entered, he looked visibly nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he extended them toward John. "General Carter," he began, his voice unsteady, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I don't deserve your time, but I needed to tell you in person how sorry I am." John studied him for a moment before nodding. "Sit down, Officer Turner. Let's talk." For hours, the two men spoke about the incident, about the choices that had led them to that moment, and about the broader issues they both now sought to address. Mark was candid about his struggles, his biases, and the painful lessons he had learned since that fateful day. John listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step," he said finally. "But true redemption comes from what you do next. Words are important, but actions matter more." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I want to do better, sir. I want to be part of the solution." The ripple effect. As the months turned into a year, the changes sparked by the incident began to take root. The blueprint for trust and accountability became a model for reform, adopted by dozens of cities across the country. Police-community relations improved in tangible ways, with trust surveys showing marked increases in neighborhoods where the initiatives had been implemented. John also saw the personal impact of his work. At one event, a woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "My son wants to become a police officer because of you," she said. "He believes he can make a difference." Moments like these reminded John why he continued to push forward, despite the challenges and sacrifices. A legacy defined. As his movement grew, John began to consider the future. He couldn't lead the charge forever, and he believed in empowering others to carry the torch. With Harold's help, he established the Carter Leadership Academy, a training program for emerging leaders in law enforcement, education, and community activism. The academy focused on teaching the principles John had championed throughout his life: integrity, empathy, accountability, and courage. Its graduates would go on to become change makers in their own right, ensuring that John's vision endured long after he was gone. Reflection and resolve. One quiet evening, John sat on the porch of his childhood friend Harold's home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The journey had been long and grueling, but as he sipped his tea, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Harold joined him, settling into the chair beside him. "You've done good work, John," he said, his voice warm. "But tell me, what's next?" John smiled faintly, his eyes fixed on the fading light. The work is never done, Harold. But maybe, just maybe, I can rest a little, knowing it's in good hands. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, John felt a quiet peace. His fight for justice, dignity, and respect had become more than a moment. It was a movement. And though he would eventually step back, his legacy would continue to inspire generations to come. In the end, John Carter's story was not just about one man's courage, but about the power of unity and the enduring hope for a better, fairer world.